Thank you and good afternoon. I thought what I would do today is just read to you very briefly from my book, introducing you, my listeners, to my story in the same way that I introduce my readers to it, and then step back and talk about what we make of what's really a remarkable story here. So let me just read for a few moments. From Passing Strange, a Gilded Age tale of love and deception across the color line. Edward V. Brown, the census taker, moved slowly down North Prince Street, knocking on each and every door in this Flushing neighborhood of Queens, New York. It was June 5th, 1900, a mild and sunny day in the first spring of a new century, and as federal census agents had done once a decade for more than 100 years, he was counting Americans, compiling a mosaic portrait of the nation. As Brown made his way down the street, he encountered immigrants from Germany, England, Ireland, and Poland, families supported by men who worked as policemen, machinists, and clerks. At number 50, he met Mary Chase, a 60-year-old widow from Rhode Island, and took note of her black housekeeper, Deborah Peterson. He had counted some 72 white residents on the street thus far, and Peterson was the first black person he had encountered. But then he walked next door and knocked at the large and comfortable home at 48 North Prince Street. 2 black servants lived here. Phoebe Martin was a 33-year-old widow, and Clarine Eldridge, just 14, was scarcely older than the children she'd been hired to watch. It was afternoon, and Grace, age 9, Ada, age 8, and Sydney, age 6, were home from school, perhaps playing with their 3-year-old brother Wallace. Whoever answered the door probably invited the census taker into the parlor. Neither the servants nor the children could have answered his long list of personal questions about the family. And so, Edward Brown entered the home to talk to Ada Todd, the lady of the house. Her husband James was away, she said, so Mrs. Todd sat down to answer the census agent's long list of questions herself. Brown hardly needed to ask her race. With a glance at her dark complexion and wavy black hair, he noted her color of skin as black. Mrs. Todd reported that her parents came from Georgia, and she informed Mr. Brown that she could read and write. She said that she was born in Georgia in December 1862, and if Brown remembered his history, he might have wondered if Ada Todd had been born a slave. That question was not on his list, though, and he would not have asked. Mrs. Todd then told the census man about her husband. She said that she'd married her husband, James, 18 years earlier in 1882. He was a black man, some 20 years older than her. Born in the West Indies, he had come to the United States in 1870 and later become a naturalized citizen. Now, she said, he had a job as a traveling steel worker. Brown perhaps noted that the house seemed proof Mr. Todd had done pretty well for himself, even if his job often kept him away from his home and his children. Mrs. Todd explained that there had been 5, the 4 still at home, and a child who had died as a toddler. Edward Brown took pride in the accuracy of his records, in the neat way in which he filled in the 1,350 blank boxes on each of his census sheets, recording into being a portrait of this polyglot neighborhood springing up in the sparsely settled borough of Queens. And so, he would have been stunned to learn that almost nothing Mrs. Todd told him was true. To begin with, she had knocked 2 years off her age, a gesture of vanity perhaps, and she and her husband had been married for 12 years, not 18, a fact of which Mrs. Todd was surely aware, and a lie that seems hard to fathom, since the children's ages raised no questions about their legitimacy. But the other untruths were more stunning. Her husband was not black. He was not from the West Indies. He was not a steel worker. Even his name, James Todd, was a lie. Ada Todd was in fact married to Clarence King, a celebrated public figure and the person the American Secretary of State John Hay once called the best and brightest man of his generation. King was a larger-than-life character, a Western explorer, a geologist, an accomplished writer and storyteller. He hobnobbed with presidents and congressmen, counted some of the nation's most distinguished writers and artists among his closest friends. His physical agility and bravery, combined with his keen intellect and wit, commanded near reverence from those who knew him best. With King, the historian Henry Adams wrote, "Men worshipped not so much their friend as the ideal American they all wanted to be. But of all this, of her husband's true identity, and even his real name, Ada had not a clue. Not until he lay dying of tuberculosis in Phoenix in late 1901, his last desperate hope of a desert cure gone, did James Todd write a letter to his wife and tell her who he really was. So that's the beginning of the book. And I thought I would just step back for a moment and talk about some of the larger issues here. One, of course, this book was a challenge to write. Because of the celebrated Clarence King, we know much, and of Copeland, very little. Born into slavery, she had few records to document her life. And Clarence King fought very, very hard to assure that no record of his secret life would survive. But most 19th century Americans managed to leave some trace in the records, and that's what it's the historian's job to find. The story of James and Ada Todd, of Clarence King and Ada Copeland, is a tale, I think, that tells us a number of things. It tells us how differently privacy functioned in the late 19th century. Here was a man, a very public figure, who led a double life for 13 years, largely in New York City, and no one, not his family, not his friends, ever found out. It's a story that tells us about the ways in which people could reinvent themselves in the great American cities of the late 19th century, ex-slaves, immigrants, or people like Clarence King. And above all, of course, it's a story about race. Clarence King was blonde-haired and blue-eyed. How could he pass himself off as a black man? Well, his gambit exposes the absurdity of the laws about racial classification that sprang up in the wake of emancipation as Southern states struggled to define black people and to deny them their rights. These new laws sought to make race fixed. They specified that if just one of your 8 great-grandparents was black, you were black, and you could be assigned to ride in the Jim Crow cars. But by decoupling race from appearance, by saying that one's ancestry mattered more than the color of one's skin, these laws actually made it possible for a Euro-American like King, a man who had absolutely no African ancestry whatsoever, to claim a black heritage. So he could pass the wrong way across the color line. In an era when many light-complexioned people of African ancestry disguised or hid their heritage in order to claim the privileges of whiteness in the United States, Clarence King moved the other direction, into Ada Copeland's rich African-American world. And finally, I would just say that this is a story about a tale about how stories are told and not told in American history. King's secret marriage came to light in 1933, more than 3 decades after his death, when his widow, who now called herself Ada King, went to court to claim the inheritance she rightly thought was hers. In a sensational trial, she read her husband's love letters out loud in a Manhattan courtroom because she needed to prove to the world that she was married to this man. Now, for 32 years, she had received a monthly stipend from the executors of his estate, and now she wanted the body of the trust fund. But she learned in that courtroom that there was no money. King had died broke, and the money she had received every month came from King's close friend, the Secretary of State John Hay, once the personal secretary to Abraham Lincoln, to keep her story quiet. It was hush money to protect the reputation of his friend. And finally, I would say that King's subsequent biographers never did anything with this. This aspect of King's life upset them. They wanted to focus on his distinguished scientific career as an explorer and geologist. And so those biographers missed an extraordinary opportunity, because Ada Copeland Todd King lived that long century from Civil War to civil rights. She did not die until 1964 at the age of 103, one of the very last Americans to have been born into slavery. No one ever sought her out to tell her story, though she had lived in the same home for more than 60 years. I think I'll stop there, and we can come back and talk more about some of the issues this raises.
Martha, let me ask you, weren't there children out of that marriage?
Yes, there were 4 children out of the marriage. The 2 girls married as white women. They had to leave their mother at home when they went to City Hall to swear that they were white for their marriage licenses. Their 2 brothers registered for the World War I draft the following year, and they were both put in all-black Jim Crow regiments. So the story of how this family was classified as black and white changes over the course of the entire 20th century.
It is a remarkable story, just a remarkable story. Miriam, we talk about Cesar Chavez in almost saint-like terms, at least at the time when he was leading the Farm Workers Union. And, I mean, it didn't have to be just in California. I mean, I remember going to meetings with him in Chicago and all over the country, and he was lionized all over the world, as a matter of fact, in the grape growers' strike and so forth. Tell us something about who Cesar Chavez was and who his friends were. What's one of the most fascinating stories is that Cesar Chavez was not alone in the campaign that he launched in favor of the farm workers.
Well, my book is an untold story of a different kind. It is more recent history, and I had the advantage of being able to still talk to many of the people who live